Good morning, everybody. Here we are at Lecture 4. Penelope's joined us, as usual, and we're going to talk about the role of emotions in the development of social psychology. So this lecture kind of represents an important shift in our course, right? That is, philosophy gives way to psychology. And so I hope by now that you maybe have gained somewhat of an appreciation for philosophy, because I know a lot of us don't necessarily like philosophy, but how philosophy really took the role of explaining mental phenomenon before psychology as a science was born. So emotion was, foundational to this transition from philosophy to psychology. We look at the soul, we look at the mind, we look at the body, and then we look at mental function as a component of these, depending on and then we talk about visceral experience, and that will lead to the concept of embodied emotion. Emotion serves as a theoretical space where all these multiple phenomenon converge, right? And they share space and they influence each other, and they prompt people to explore now in this arena in an ever more increasingly empirical fashion. So emotion. Thomas Brown is credited with the use of this term. We begin to use in the language of philosophy on the mind, right? Lectures on philosophy in the mind. Think about that. So we're really at that tipping point where we're going to start talking psychology. He thought in part to help view the move more theologically oriented theory to secular theory. And this is a big aspect of the scientific underpinnings. Note that we had an awful lot of philosophers and then religious folk really pick up the ball to discuss, describe, and explore the concept of emotion, not using that term. But we see now that the secular is ascending, right? And they're going to look for more empirical explanations. So long passions, so long affections, and we're going to move forward to using the term emotion. And what's going to be, I think, really fascinating to you guys throughout the rest of the course is how is emotion defined. And remember, that's something I'm going to put on you as we move through the course as well to develop your own definition. So the physical sciences are beginning to gain prominence, and they're inspired scientific criteria to the study of emotion, because scientists tend to hang together, even across disciplines. So the scientific method is now being exported to other fields that were maybe more metaphysically explored previously. So what do we see then in the study of emotion? Well, it's multifaceted, right? So it's not a single construct necessarily. There's going to be a huge effort to reduce it to its component parts, right? And this reductionism is going to be really important over the next 150 years. And then we'll begin to counter that as we move towards the end of the course, right? Classification. So emotional systems are going to begin to be classified. But we saw the rudiments of that all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, Hippocrates, etc. were working classification systems. And then we're going to begin to explore the interactions. So mind-body interactions may in fact, but notice that the philosophers were looking at that as well. So from Brown to Chalmers, Brown, what does he say? He comes at the idea of emotion. They're not willful, okay? They emerge on their own. Boom, they just occur, right? They're passive in that regard, because since they're not willful and they emerge on their own, it's not like we have a lot of control over it necessarily. We might have control in inhibition or suppression, but not necessarily in the arousal, according to Brown, and we'll hear differing viewpoints. So still no clear definition though, right? They're chipping around it, but not really getting there. So for Chalmers, it's not appetites or affections, it's not bodily. So he's putting emotions up into the mind pretty much. He's not going to talk soul too much, right? We're moving away from that. So this definition, check this out, because this is really freaking strange, right? Emotions are mental, and they're characterized by a peculiar vividness of feeling. Well, that's not really helpful, right? If that's, boy, this feels peculiarly vivid, then I'm going to call it emotion. Yeah, but that doesn't tell us a lot, right? He's going to use visual perception as a metaphor for emotional experience, and notice that visual perception is the transduction of neural impulses generated on the retina. So the metaphor is that emotions are probably an add-on, right? That they're a response to some system, mental or mental system, But again, it's not clear how he's getting at this, right? But that's fine because they're just getting the ball rolling. Now, the science of psychology is established with emotion becoming a core component. So emotion is central to the establishment of psychology, and especially social psychology, which maybe seem kind of strange because we might think in terms of emotion as clinical psychology for the most part, but that's usually when we're talking about emotional disturbances and emotional disorders. When we're talking about emotion, we're usually talking about some form of interaction or some types of associations. So far more in the ballpark of social psychology, but certainly of tremendous interest to developmental psychologists when they study how we acquire emotions over the lifespan. So Darwin produces Origin of Species, and man, the world has been turned on its head. Because Darwin's saying, hey look, you know, this is, and we're going to revisit Darwin again and again and again in this course, and those neo-Darwinists that use Darwin as a jumping off point, right, Penelope? So, and Darwin is saying that Penelope and I are a lot closer than anyone ever imagined. And that's kind of a strange idea, right? That we share, right? We share components, and that's pretty weird to think about. So Alexander Bain, Herbert Spencer embrace physiological and or evolutionary principles. So Darwin is making the rounds, and his ideas are setting the world on fire. Neurophysiology becomes a science, and what do we know about Sigmund Freud? Yeah, neuroscience was Sigmund Freud's original area of study, right? So the people are getting excited and they're getting jacked up about this stuff. Agnosticism takes hold, so now we're not going to be looking for religious explanations. And people get confused about Darwin because Darwin was a Christian, and he didn't have any desire to give up his Christianity. But he begins to build a divide between the empirical and the religious, right? So this agnosticism then is no one's trying to say, hey, God doesn't exist. People are more inclined to say, look, I don't know if God exists or not, but what I do know is what I can empirically demonstrate in a laboratory. So mind-body dualism exists, but it's two sides of a coin, so it's not separate things. It's two aspects of us, and have a profound influence on each other potentially. Now, people will some theorists stress that interaction to a greater extent than others. But we begin to discuss objective physical versus subjective mental experience. So we have the dualism, and we realize that can yield two different types of experience, but in fact we acknowledge that they're connected. But nonetheless, at this point, physical experience dominates theorizing, and it's easier to tap into, right? If you want to use a cold pressor task, you can stick someone's hand into a bucket of ice water, and you can measure the effects on the person physiologically. That's a lot easier to pin down than it is to pin down the results of the mental activity. Note that with fMRI machines, with our love of neuroscience at this point in time, we're able to actually get into these areas of what's going on in the mind. So the big change as well. Associationism, Spencer, what's the deal? He adopts the notion that heritability framing emotions as mechanisms that arise from our evolutionary past. So you can see the influence of Darwin. And it creates some interesting implications then about emotions. Remember when I talked about Jane Owl and Clan of the Cave Bear at the very beginning of the class? If we go back 40,000 years to that time, right, when Homo sapiens and Neanderthal coexisted, right, and the emotions that were expressed, were the emotions the same for those two species? Okay? And were the emotions that either of those two species experienced at that point 40,000 years ago similar to what we experience now? How has the process of natural selection shaped emotional experience? And that's a whole another side issue, right? But free will is diminished, if not completely discredited. And you go, well, that's kind of sucks maybe, you know, and it's, well, if Spencer is into associations, then what we're doing is laying the groundwork for stimulus to trigger response, right? So very early kind of look at a Pavlovian model of stimulus and response that might be out of our control, that might operate, you know, that we can only react to, that we can't choose from the onset. We're bound by our collective heritability. So if we think back to now Aristotle and potential, right, what exists in terms of potential? Well, it really is determined by our specification, if you will, right? So emotions are not cognitive or sentimental, but represent an aggregation of both types of experience, so they're becoming this combined phenomenon, right, that is more complex. And of course, you'll have to work that. You are biting hard. You should not do that. Okay? The greater the level of associations embedded in sensory processor or experience, the potential for greater emotional experience and or intensity. And we're going to get back to that intensity thing here down the road, so I promise that. And here's just some covers of the books that, you know, Spencer and Bain, these are Bain's books, right? So the senses and the intellect, the emotions and the will, you can see what's really kind of on the mind of the theorists at this time. And Bain then begins to take this more physiological approach. It's emotions to be understood based on observable bodily activity, and this is this term embodiment or embodied emotion, that emotion actually generates throughout the body. It's not just an intellectual phenomenon. Spencer, like Spencer, there's an aggregate quality. Single emotions were not seen as possessing unique qualities, but in fact, it's an aggregate of mental and physical experience. So, Bain's psychology then, in looking at the psychology of the human being, is tripartite. He says we possess an intellect, we possess a will, and we possess emotion, right? And then he goes on to describe 13 topics of emotion. And I think this is a fascinating transition, and you can see how this probably shaped a lot of thought as we move forward. And see what you think, if it resonates. I kind of like this because what we're looking at then is the human interaction with the human environment, right? So emotions of harmony and conflict. And that might be then represented on a continuum, harmony to conflict, you know, but it really specifies how we interact with others, right? Emotions of terror, and this is, in fact, our relationship to stimuli within our environment. Emotions of the self, and this is a fascinating topic in and, you know, I was going to say in and of itself, yeah, no pun intended there, but what we're looking at then, especially in developmental psychology, this becomes hugely important around the time of infancy through toddlerhood and beyond. Emotions of action and pursuit, right? And this is something we've been looking at. Occasionally, we've been working. I've been working with some students on a measure to detect the level of predatory instinct in a person, right? And so that might, in fact, be in line with this idea of emotions of action and pursuit. Emotions of intellect, right? And it goes on, sympathy and imitation. You're going to see how important these are as we talk to other theorists as we move through the course. Tender emotions, aesthetic emotions, so our response to art, right? Bain's going to put in a separate category from all the others. Bottom line, though, he's creating categories, and he's creating categories that reflect our experience as connected to our world. So let's think about that convergence from slide 2 then. What are the components, the parts of your emotional experience? And this is going to be homework 3, so what I'm asking you to do is pick one emotion, and then let's talk about what leads to it, right? That there is some kind of stimulus to which we're responding, and emotion is part of that response syndrome, if you will, right? So pick one emotion, what leads to it, what is present when it happens, that emotion, right? And then what is the result? So let's take that emotion and let's look at the antecedents, what precedes it, right? What stimulates it, and then what happens, what's the consequence of that emotion. So we're essentially exploring a mechanistic functionalist view of emotion. That is, that we're the mechanism, and emotions serve a function. They're activated by that stimulus, and then they have a resulting change on our thinking or behavior, right? That's the consequence. So this is homework 3, and you can see I'm pretty sure I'm getting a little sketchy on all the details. I'll be honest, I'm kind of overwhelmed at times, and all I know is I got to do a bunch of shit. and I have a list of shit to do, right? And sometimes when I'm feeling too totally overwhelmed, I don't get too involved with picking and choosing what I'm doing at any given time. I just know that I have to do things. So let's take a look at this, and I'm pretty sure the template's up there. Homework 3, from stimulus to emotion consequence, right? And this is a team assignment. This is team level. And the template will look something like that. So you put your name there, and then you select your emotion, right? And I want, if there's, how many ever team members you have, right? Whether it's 5, 6, 7, etc. If there's 7, you're going to have to create an extra space on there. But if it's 6, this is fine. 5, each team member pick an emotion, right? Put your name, then put the emotion. Now, where are we going to go with that? Well, now steps 2 and 3. Then for a different emotion, an emotion different than the one you picked, what might lead to the result? What might lead to that emotion and result from it? Boy, I butchered that. So what I'm saying is, for example, Mark. I put my name on there, Mark. Last name too, please. Right. So Mark Polifrone. The emotion I pick is sadness, right? Now, someone else in the group then responds for 2 and 3 to someone else's emotion pick. So in this case, Raul then might say, well, I want to do sadness that Mark supplied, so Raul is then going to do parts 2 and 3, right? So it might lead to and result from the emotion. So you fill it out. Now, the name is, of course, Raul is responding, so Raul is going to put his name in there. He's going to put the emotion with sadness, and he doesn't need to reference me, right? And then give me an example of what would lead to it. That's the stimulus, and then what was the result? So notice, just as I described, we're looking at the antecedent, we're looking at the consequent, and the mechanism is the emotion itself. We can kind of then surmise what the potential functions might be. And I think this is a useful way for us to look at virtually kind of any emotion that is out there. Does that make sense? Okay. And if it doesn't make sense, what are you going to do? You're going to ask me, right? So you're going to come to office hours, you're going to come to our Thursday afternoon session, you're going to email me, whatever it takes, so that we get you clear on this. Also, I think that discussing between your team members is a nice way to facilitate your understanding. This is one of the reasons I'm using groups in the class, is so you guys can help each other. And I know the groups might have gotten off to a slightly rocky start, but we'll get in the groove and we'll make this shit happen, right? All right, enough of homework 3. I want to jump to William James, emotion, mind stuff. And William James wrote The Principles of Psychology, 1890, a 2-volume work that stands to this day as one of the legendary works in psychology. He has a whole chapter devoted to emotion. It's a chapter devoted to the self. And that's the way he kind of conceptualized. Now, James was described as an epiphenomenalist, and what is important then is the phenomenon that someone is experiencing becomes the object of study, right? The object of analysis. So we're often then conducting thought experiments with the graduate student. So we try to arouse a phenomenon, and then the graduate students surmise, cogitate, etc., and analyze the situation. But it begins with phenomenon as the chief part there. I have to interrupt a cat here in their activity. Olive, what are you doing? Yeah, you look sneaky and suspicious. So, mental events are side effects of physical processes of the body. And notice how this really fits nicely with phenomenalists, because the body is an easy set of phenomenon to study. So mental events are side effects of physical processes of the body. James puts the body first, and this is kind of a strange perspective, different than many. The causal direction is singular. I mean, for James, it's body affects mind. Mind is explaining the actions of the body, essentially. Emotions are the conclusions of a process which explains the physiological sensation perceptual process. So they're a tack on, they're an add-on. And here's the amazing way that it's put is we see a bear, we run, and then we realize that we're afraid. The fear is essentially the explanation of the response to the stimulus. So for James, it's stimulus, response, right? And notice, this could be an instinctual stimulus-response relationship, or it could be learned. I don't think that really matters to James. But then the emotion is the explanation. let's hang on to that idea. I mean, James is important in this respect, and we're going to see this idea reemerge kind of in different guises throughout the course. Huh? So there's a heavy reliance on previous experience. As I mentioned, it can be innate or learned in this regard. We see someone else get eaten by a bear, and then we eaten by a bear. Eaten by a bear, right? And we say, wow, that really sucked, right? And we learn, right? But then, some people say that we might have an innate fear to spiders, an innate fear to snakes, right? And these objects as part of our genetic legacy. Okay, quite possibly. And you can see how natural selection would take care of that. The people who were not afraid of snakes, they got bitten, they died, they didn't reproduce. So those who were inherently afraid of snakes, right, had a reproductive advantage, and that's why we see the fear of snakes. If it could be a genetic, response, then we see that progress through our species. Now, James and Lang, were heavily criticized, but it didn't seem to matter. Much of the ascendancy of this theory is the ability to weather criticism, and that's what happens in psychology and all sciences. Someone puts out a theory, a whole bunch of other people, criticize it, people provide evidence to support it, evidence to refute it, and they bang it out, right? Well, but the strict adherence to laboratory science of the time, William Wundt, who created the first experimental psychology, social psychology lab in the country, in the United States, right? He was on a parallel track. Observation was everything. So these become, super duper empiricists. Observation, measurement are key, right? So it's laboratory manipulation, that's the game we're playing now, and measurement. The theory was simple, relied on observable phenomenon, that's the way to go. So strangely simple that James didn't even attempt to map specific emotions onto specific bodily responses, and I think that's a key failure in James' theory. We're going to come back for part 2, and we're going to look at a counter